Now let's configure a form to take use of this functionality. Double-click on the Create Item form from your Solution Explorer. Modify the real estate so you can see the form clearly. As you can see, the left-hand side of our split container is blank. This is a great place for us to add image functionality. Let's begin. From your toolbox, drag over a panel control. Place it in the left-hand side of your split container. Adjust it for both size and position so it can display the images clearly. Let's modify the name. Change the name to Panel Image Management. Now let's insert a picture box. A picture box can display images from our database. From your toolbox, drag over a picture box control. Make sure you drop it onto the panel control so it becomes a child of the panel control. Resize it to be a bit larger. Let's modify the size mode property of this picture box. You have 5 choices for size mode. Normal, which will automatically return the default values for the image based on the database settings. Stretch image, which is the most useful as it stretches the image to the container of the picture box control. Auto size, which allows automatic sizing of the image. Center image, which centers the image inside the picture box control. And zoom, which provides a close-up look at that image. This is useful when you want to see the image in higher resolution. Let's select Stretch Image as the size mode. Now let's set up the data bindings. In your Properties window, scroll to the top. First, let's go ahead and change the picture box name to something more intelligent. Let's call it Picture Box Image. Right above that, you'll see the Data Bindings property. Expand that. Because it's a picture box, we see the image bubbled up here right within the data bindings. This is because the image property of a picture box is the most commonly bound to property. Select the drop-down list. Navigate to the Other Data Sources. Expand Project Data Sources until you see DS Images. Expand DS Image and expand Image. We'll want to bind to the image attribute inside our dsimages.image table. Select the image property. This will automatically add the DS images and image binding source into our component tray, as you can see in the lower middle part of your screen. Now let's provide the capability to navigate between one or many images per item. In your toolbox, navigate to the Data tab. Drag over a binding navigator. Be sure to drop it inside your panel control. Now we have a binding navigator just for our images, much like we have a binding navigator for all our items. This way we have a natural master detail view for our Create Item images inside of our Create Item form. For the picture box, select the Smart task at the very top of the picture box. Choose the Dock and Parent Container option. This will allow our user interface to be much more friendly. Now let's configure our binding navigator. Select the binding navigator and let's give it a name. Scroll to the top of the Properties window and call it Binding Navigator Images. The next thing we'll need to do is set the binding source. Scroll down. For binding source, select the drop-down list. Select the image binding source. The image binding source is already added to our component tray, so that's why we can select it readily from the binding source property. As you remember, our image table in the database has a thumbnail column. We decided to store our images as smaller thumbnails when we have any situations where we need to return multiple images. That way, we don't have to return the entire image should the user not wish to do anything specific with that image. The thumbnails are going to be very useful for us to get a preview of all the images associated with an item ID. We'll provide this functionality so that the user can see all the images associated to an item, and then they can select a particular thumbnail image to view that image in a larger size within this picture box that we've created. There's a unique and clever way to do this. You can do this using the DataGridView control. Let's go ahead and take advantage of that. You can find the DataGridView control within the Data tab inside your toolbox. The DataGridView control is a significant enhancement new to Visual Studio 2005. It succeeds the former DataGrid control and provides much more robust capabilities. One of these is the ability to manipulate and edit columns in design mode. Let's give it a try. Let's drag over a DataGridView and drop it below the panel control. Let's call it DataGridView Image. Now let's edit the columns of this. By default, if we ran this application, it would bring back all the images. Let's see what this looks like, and then it'll help us understand what kind of functionality we need to program. Press F5 to run the application. Select the Create Item button. As you can see, we now see images. But what happens when we scroll through our images? The image doesn't change. Even though we're scrolling through different properties, the image is not changing. And by default, we have no data inside of our DataGridView control. Let's go ahead and modify that. Return back to Visual Studio, stop the application. Let's configure the DataGridView a little bit further. Along the way, we'll keep checking our progress so we can understand what else needs to be added. Running and checking your application and testing the functionality between each code segment is a best practice and enables you to understand the impact of those code changes in a much more agile way. Right-click on the DataGridView control. Select Edit Columns. Currently now, we don't have any columns listed in our DataGridView control. We can change that by modifying the data source property. Cancel out, and in the Properties window, select Data Source. Scroll down to Other Data Sources, Project Data Sources. And from here, we're going to select the Images table. Now this adds all our images. This was one way to configure our DataGridView image. Another way to do this would be to go to the Data Source window and navigate into the DS Images dataset into the Image table and then just drag that over onto our form. So these are both two common ways to bind a DataGridView control to a data source. Let's run the application and see what we have so far. Press F5. Select the Create Item button. Now, you see we have all our images inside of a DataGridView control. We could even go ahead and select these images and navigate to them, but they're not quite displayed in an easy-to-understand format. You see that the thumbnails, though, are much more easier to interpret and bring back the data in a smaller view. There's a clever technique where you can actually take this DataGridView, which looks like a traditional spreadsheet, and modify it so it only shows you the thumbnails in a much more easy-to-understand format. And then, what we'll do is when the user clicks on a particular thumbnail, we'll show the image in the top box over here. On top of that, when the user navigates through the items in the dataset, they'll also be able to see the image and the associated thumbnails refresh. Let's continue to add this functionality. Return back to Visual Studio and press Stop. Right-click on DataGridView Image. Select Edit Columns. Now, because we have our data bound, we see all the columns that we have available. Let's sort the properties for each column alphabetically. Press the A to Z button. As you see in the Properties window, when we click on a particular column, you see the properties listed for you in the right-hand part of your screen. The ability to manage these properties at design time is one of the most useful features of the DataGridView. One of these properties is the frozen property. If you change this to be true, so this means that when the DataGridView is displayed, all the columns from this point and before will now be marked as frozen. Anything after will not. This is similar to the freeze panes functionality in Excel. When the user scrolls to look at the columns on the far right, any columns that you've selected as frozen will always be visible. We don't need to see all these columns. In this case, we're just creating functionality to view thumbnails. Click the Remove button to remove all the columns but the thumbnail column. This is the unexpected use of the DataGridView control, not showing traditional rows and columns, but using it to display images instead. As we see, we have the header text that says Thumbnail. We don't really need this header text to indicate thumbnail. It's the only column we have, and it's fairly obvious that these are just images. What we can do is configure the row header's visible property. Scroll down and notice that our image layout property is set to normal instead of stretch or zoom. This is because we're dealing with thumbnails. Click OK. Because we don't need this thumbnail header property, let's configure some of the settings in our DataGridView to remove that and other properties. In your Properties window, scroll down to Row Headers Visible. Right now, the row headers are visible. Toggle this to be false. As you can see, any of your changes are reflected immediately in the designer. Let's continue to configure this. Right now, this is not very attractive. Should there be no thumbnail, what the user is going to see is unnecessary data. Run the application by hitting F5 and let's take a look. Select the Create Item button. As you can see, we see an X button as well as the thumbnail. This is unnecessary data. We also need to add functionality not to show us all the thumbnails from the database. Let's continue to add this. Go back to Visual Studio and select Stop. The thumbnail DataGrid view is read-only. Let's go ahead and change that. In the Properties window, change the Allow User to Add Rows property to False. This will get rid of that little X that we see. Also toggle the Allow User to Delete Rows property to be false. Now let's work on some of the display properties. Let's resize the DataGrid view to have a little smaller width and a little more height. That way we can see multiple images at once. Let's go ahead and change some other behavioral properties. For example, in order to make the data more easily discernible, you can change the display properties for every other row in the data grid. This is really useful for text, and it's also a nice feature for images as well. We can do this by modifying the alternating rows default cell style property. Let's scroll down. Click on the button next to alternating rows default cell style. This will pop up the cell style builder. Feel free to use your own colors. Let's change the back color to be a web color. We'll choose a lighter color. Let's choose powder blue. Let's also modify the selection back color. This is the color that will be shown as the back color when the user selects a particular thumbnail. By default, it uses the Windows highlight properties. This may not be the most elegant color to use when you're working with Windows. Each user can configure their Windows properties to be any type of highlight color. In order to control this, go ahead and choose the selection back color to always use the standard color that you want your application to use. Select the drop-down box, select Web, and let's select an ivory color. Now for the selection 4 color, let's go ahead and change this to be a darker color. Let's select a navy color. Down below in the preview pane, you can see what inherited cell styles will look like. You can see what the normal selection would look like, as well as the selected item highlight. Select OK to accept your changes. Now let's configure a setting for how columns are automatically sized. By default, it's none, so they won't be automatically sized. Let's change that to reflect the displayed cells. Based on the data in the cells that are displayed for that column, the column will automatically resize to fit that data. This makes sense for our images. Now take a look at this form. You see a big gray box here. Do we really want a big gray box even if there are no images? We can modify that by modifying the background color. By default, it uses the app workspace. Instead, let's choose the window as the background color. This will allow our data grid to take on the properties of the window behind it, so it blends in even when there's no data. Now let's get rid of the border style. Again, we want this to be almost invisible when we have no images being returned from the database. Select None for border style. As you can see, we've come quite a long way from changing this from the traditional row and column data grid view to something customized for images. The next thing we want to modify is our column headers border style. Scroll down to the column headers border style. By default, this is raised. Let's change this to be none. Now we no longer see that bevel around our thumbnail. For that matter, why are we even seeing our column headers at all? We don't really need this thumbnail to be shown. Let's modify the column headers visible to be false. That's much better. Now let's modify our column headers height size mode. Instead of auto size for adjusting the header size for our columns, let's select Enable Resizing. If our user wants to resize the column headers, we should give them the ability to do so. Now let's scroll down and modify our row template. Our row template allows us to use specific properties and characteristics for the way our rows are displayed. Expand on the row template property and click on the button for the default cell style. Again, this pops up our cell style builder. Notice, for any particular rows that do not have any value, we can provide some sort of indicator. For example, no value, or 2 hyphens to indicate that there's no data returned. This is very useful when you're working with text-based data in your data grid view. In this case, we're working with images, so we don't want to display anything at all if there's no images in the database. Let's change the selection back color to be a light yellow. Select OK.